Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Terry Taurus. I'm a member of the FANHS Museum Board, and it's good to see all of you. The Filipino American National Historical Society is a nationwide organization that started in 1982 and it's headquartered in Seattle, Washington. And now we have 40 chapters across the United States. There's also a National Pinoy Archives in Seattle and our National Filipino American History Museum that's located in Stockton. So our museum, it opened up in 2016 and we started having presentations on the third Sunday of each month that we called Afternoon at the Museum. But because of COVID, we had to shut down last year in March. But now we're gearing up to reopen in the last half of June, the weekend after Father's Day, hopefully, if all goes well. So we wanted to get back into gear and do a presentation today so we can get back into the swing of things. So originally this panel was going to be talking last year in October of 2020 for Filipino American History Month. So we're glad that they agreed to speak during this month of May for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So they'll each speak for about 20 minutes and then we'll have a question and answer period after they're done speaking. And so if you want, you can put your questions in the chat and I'll be monitoring the chat and also the waiting room. And then afterwards we can have a question and answer period. So just please remember to mute yourself if you're not the speaker. And that way we won't have any interruptions or confusion. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Richard Tanaza.
Hello, good to be here. Thank you all for coming. The three of us who are speaking have had rather different backgrounds. We're all mestizo, but we've had very different backgrounds. And I'm going to start off by focusing on on my own background, of course, and which. So let's see. I think I have slides to show, and I would like to begin those. That's going to make me disappear probably. Okay, so I say here mestizo, and am I brown or am I white? And of course, well, that's because my own heritage is Filipino and white. Others are Filipino and black or Filipino and something else. But this is my mestizo background. Turns out about 40 years ago, I was having a series of dreams that went on for a couple of years, I think. And I was frequently dreaming about brown and white animals, and I'm sure it had to do with my heritage. The term mestizo is a Spanish word describing mixed race offspring, and it originally started with the conquistadors coming from Spain in the early 1500s, late 1400s, and marrying or interacting with native women and having children that were referred to as mestizos. The Spaniards later applied this to mixed race people in the Philippines, like Jose Rizal, for example. Remember, most of the South American countries and Mexico and the Philippines were all colonies of Spain. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the San Joaquin, Sacramento Delta agricultural labor here in California, big agriculture, was performed by Asians, starting with Chinese immigrants first, and then they were excluded by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then Japanese took over until they were excluded by a Japanese Exclusion Act called the Gentleman's Agreement. And then Filipinos came in. What got Filipinos in was a war that America had against the people of the Philippines. And here's some rather brutal slides coming up. But the Filipino-American War lasted 1899 to 1902. It went on for about 20 years, but this, according to the American government, this when it was. The Filipinos were outgunned, tortured, killed. They lost the war and became a colony of America. When they became a colony of America, this gave Filipinos the right to immigrate into the Philippines as into the US, I mean, from the Philippines as nationals, not aliens, but they couldn't become citizens, they couldn't own property, and they couldn't marry white women. So during the 1920s, over 30,000 Filipinos came to California to work. They were mainly single and young, and they had a problem because there were no women around. After work, they often dressed up and socialized. These guys would be all farm workers, but dressed up in the evening to go to a dance hall or somewhere else, somewhere else to socialize, but they could not marry according to California law. There was a drought in Oklahoma and the rest of the Great Plains states from 1930 to 34. And this turned Oklahoma and other areas of the Great Plains into what's referred to as a dust bowl. It turned into a desert. So people had to leave in order to survive. And my own mother and her family left Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl to survive. They picked cotton in Texas and Arizona on their way to California. Most of these places, most of these people, the 300,000 of them were heading to California to work in the fields. When they got to the fields in California, they ran into Filipinos. We were also here working in the fields. And the picture on the left is mother and family were living when they first got to California on their way here. And they met these young Filipino men. And this led to fraternization between white Okies, so-called, and brown Filipino farm workers. Whoops. Something's not working here, but oh, okay, so the women marked A and B were my mother and my aunt, and they were at the time probably, my mother was, I think, 14 and my aunt was about 11. More, this time my grandmother's in the picture between my aunt and my mother. And my grandmother was divorced and associated with, well, she had a Filipino boyfriend too, pastor from Ilocos Norte, Buwag. And my aunt was probably only 11. And I don't think it was too serious a romance, but I'm not sure. And so that era, there were few women around. This is a funeral of a family friend then in 1938. And the only women there, you can see to the left are my aunt, my grandmother, and my mother. And to the right of them is my father. The men outnumbered the women about 15 to 1 in those days. So my parents then met while picking peas at Pescadero, working in the fields. They couldn't get married in California. They had to go up to Washington. And 9 months after they were married, I was born. So here I am, the little mestizo baby, just a few months old, probably. How old would I be? I look like maybe 3 months or so. For some reason, my computer, oops. This is 40 years later, my father and I, when I'm about 40 and my father's about 75. So growing up in two worlds, sort of, I was, you know, here's my sister and I on the left with my father in the background and two so-called uncles. Everybody was uncle. And I remember very clearly that little kind of sailor suit or whatever it was that one of my Filipino uncles bought for me. from age 7, I lived with my grandmother in San Francisco, my grandmother and aunt, and she worked nights as a janitor to help support us. Raymond Elementary School. I'm up in the back row, the third from the left, and it was pretty white. There wasn't much diversity in the grammar school that I went to in San Francisco. There was a little more in high school, but not much in this class, and very few Filipinos. I think there were 5 or 6 Filipinos in the whole school with 3,000 students. And so I became Mexican for a while. And here I am as a Mexican with my friend Pete Nava and my girlfriend, Rosa Maria. My first, I had a Filipino girlfriend along the way, but up in Washington State, where my father was living then, a bunch of weird circumstances caused my father to be living up in Washington. And this is my girlfriend and my aunt and uncle, my girlfriend Norma, and here she is. We were together for a while. She went to karate school in the Yakima Valley and also was a nurse. Here I am in my first trip to the Philippines, and I had plenty of offers to get a wife in the Philippines. Of course, these are all relatives of mine at the family house in Sinay, Ilocos. These are my mestizo siblings, my sister Lillian, my sister Dorothy in the middle, or to my left, and my brother Nick, or Nicholas. So my daughters, Amy and Lori, and my mestizo grandchildren. Interesting, Jack, the one in the middle there a couple of years ago, well now, let me tell you their ages now. Dylan, the oldest in the bottom, is 23 and graduated from UCSB. And Owen, oldest in the left, in the top photo, is now a sophomore at Redlands University in Southern California. But Jack in the middle a couple of years ago came home when I was visiting and said, "Hey, Papa, 2 more Filipino, there are 2 other Filipinos in my class." He was all excited because there are 2 Filipino kids in his class. So he identifies some with being Filipino. I told you I had rats in these dreams early on, especially rats, all kinds of animals. And according to this one interpretation I found online, is that dreaming of rats indicates unwanted thoughts that you want to keep hidden during the daytime, but are likely in reality to be gnawing in your insides. And I don't know if that was true or not, but I went to this period with dreaming about brown and white animals, and I attributed it to being mestizo and wondering about my brown and white parts. So, am I brown or am I white? Am I brown or am I white? I dreamt about all these different kinds of animals. Interesting. But I guess in the end, I'm just me, neither brown nor white, but somewhere in between, more brown than white. But it's interesting, when I was a kid, I was very dark, and then I got kind of paler with age for some reason. And so that is all that I had to say. Maybe some questions will come up later, but I wanted to point out that one of our next speakers has recently published a book on his mestizo life. And so Terry, carry on to the next people.
Okay, well, we will introduce or ask Al to join in on, and okay, good. Okay, so Al, you'll have to unmute yourself, and Richard, you'll have to mute yourself, and then Al will talk, and then when he's done, he will introduce Lois.
There we
There you
go.
go.
Good afternoon. These are personal stories, experiences, and memories of growing up in California for me. My story is one of personal perspectives, experience, and perception of a first-generation mestizo born and raised locally in the 1940s through the 1960s. My story is about a world, actually, of three worlds colliding. My father from 7,000 miles away, a foreign country, my mother from the Midwest, Caucasian descent, and then myself trying to grow up and matriculate in this world. It's not expected that others should agree with my points of view or even relate to it, but it is what it is and was what it was then. Your indulgence, however, is appreciated. I began this presentation by highlighting what I have come to view as a positive in growing up half Filipino and half Caucasian. My mother being of Irish descent, raised in Southern Illinois. At this point in my life, I view my mestizo mixture and its related challenges as truly building blocks of success and proud character. Given this presentation is originating out of the Stockton chapter of the Filipino American National Historic Society, and that I was born, raised, and schooled from grammar school through graduation from junior college in Stockton, I'll focus on sharing a few of my personal experiences, my views and conclusions, and perception of a very humble beginning growing up here in Stockton. I found my education from Stockton's Delta College old campus a tremendous asset in competing in state universities, at California State University, San Bernardino for a bachelor's degree, and California State University, Bakersfield for a master's in public administration. For those of you who may desire a more detailed and less edited version of my experiences, as well as my real life exposure to some darker experiences growing up here as a first generation brown child and pre-adolescent, please obtain a copy of my book, Life Experiences of a First Generation Filipino Caucasian American, published August 2020 by Author House Publishing. Hard copies can be obtained via Author House online bookstores or via Barnes and Nobles and other retailers. There are those who have taken the time to research and write lectures about the Filipino life of Stockton. These researchers deserve kudos for their efforts and time that they have shared in interesting perspectives about Stockton and the Filipino community, what I consider to have been the cradle of Filipino life in America, originating in the 1920s. However, the information I share is from life as I witnessed it and experienced it from a personal point of view, as well as through perspectives relayed to me by my parents, relatives, mestizo friends and manongs in the church and in the community. For I was born into life here in the community, into interracial conflict and experiences that Stockton had to offer to those in post-war tumultuous years. My father began his migration to America in the mid-1920s in the hulls of a USS President ship, name unknown. It was at the time the only affordable way to get to the United States. And since his subsistence consisted of a bag of boiled eggs and a few other meager items, his trip, however, was interrupted by a need for employment in the cane fields and pineapple industry of Hawaii. Dad was able to complete his trip to the mainland in mid-1920s and was able to sustain himself here through the agricultural labor network and by working in agriculture throughout California, from the Coachella Valley in the south to Biggs in the north, and for a time as unskilled labor in the shipyards. Eventually, my dad migrated to San Francisco, where he was able to find ample employment in the hotel industry, sufficient to support his conversion into the Protestant faith and to complete a 4-year theological program at Bethany College in San Francisco. After graduation, father migrated to Stockton, California, which was a base for Filipino agricultural and other employment. It was here that he met my mother, a blue-eyed blonde, and married. I personally was born here in Stockton and at the St. Joseph Hospital. Upon leaving St. Joseph Hospital, I was taken home by my parents to 311 South Center Street. For those of you who may know Stockton historically, 311 South Center Street was about 1 block south of what was referred to as hardcore Skid Row. It was also 1 block west of El Dorado Street, the section that was the Filipino hangout area, now referred to by many as Little Manila. In those days, however, that area was simply referred to by Stocktonians as Skid Row. We soon as a family moved south of Stockton to a rural area south of McKinley Park, formerly known as Municipal Baths, where I learned to swim and joined the swim team in high school. I was later to have very pleasant memories of my first real job delivering the Stockton Record in South Stockton. I will be sharing related memories of the area as time permits, because it was from this base from which I grew up, observed Filipino culture, and matriculated into my own American world. Incidentally, while attending junior high at John Marshall Junior High south of town, it could be noted that I walked to and from school each day along the canals and over property where Van Buskirk Park is located now and Conway Homes, and the Interstate 5 now stands. It was not even in existence at that time. Just reflecting back, I remember that the west side of El Dorado Street was the preferred hanging out area for Filipino manongs. And I remember that my father's cousin regularly frequented the area and could be found hanging out at a parking meter in front of the Bataan pool hall, where he hung out. On occasion, I would accompany my father to the area when he wanted to find his cousin, whom I referred to as uncle, in order that we may invite him to our home for dinner, or when my father just wanted to find his townmates, known as kababayans, or just to catch up on news from his hometown in the Philippines or other happenings within the Filipino community. I also remembered the very strong stench of the smell permeating the area from Toscana and other favorite cigars the Filipino manongs enjoyed smoking. Other times, my father and my mother would take me down to the area now known as Little Manila to the chop suey restaurants ran by Chinese. My favorite restaurant was Canton Lo, located upstairs at 108 Washington Street. It had booths with draw drapes for privacy, and my parents had held their wedding reception there. Thus, they were very sentimental about the place, and we visited it for lunch after church regularly. On some occasions, we would simply sit in our car, observing the culture, and my father and we would consume bituka, a Chinese and Filipino delicacy, and my mother would muse through Chinese fortune cookies looking for a favorable prediction or fortune. During the winter months, I remember being at home, pans of homemade popcorn, drawing Christmas scenes on paper, working puzzles, playing table games with my parents, or my dad just guiding me through and to skillful penmanship. During junior high school, I was preoccupied trying to survive the school system and to find a social and academic comfort zone. I remember thinking, however, that a few of these high school teachers I had seemed, in my opinion, not particularly fond of teaching minority students. They seemed to be more interested in waiting for transfers to school north of town. In senior high, I would occasionally frequent a pool hall just off of El Dorado Street with a couple of my mestizo friends. I also worked part-time at a dry goods store on El Street close to what was then Golden Gate Restaurant. I would also visit Tommy's Barbershop on South El Dorado for my occasional professional haircut. Up to that time, my father simply cut my hair. Downtown Stockton, as I remember it, being the county seat, was a marvelous small metropolis. I would shop the stores after school in between bus transfers home for clothes and a piece of fruit at City Market, located on Weber Street. I still drive down Main Street and I reminisce at what used to be, and perhaps what could have been, but sadly is now no more. As a mestizo youth, one of two main nurturing influences in my life was the education system. In general, my school experience was a means of learning the American socialization processes, social etiquette, assimilating into American life, and also polishing my interpersonal skills with fellow students from a variety of cultures and ethnicities. In short, I saw the process as teaching me how to be a good American. Many of the grammar school teachers were praiseworthy. Many enjoyed their job working with students, even Filipino and other minority students. Some, in my opinion, obviously did not. The second significant influence in my first generation assimilation into America and its culture was the church. In retrospect, I consider myself to have been fortunate and truly blessed to have been raised in a church founded by and consisting of Filipinos with a predominant Filipino heritage, specifically the humble Bethany Temple on 7th Street in Stockton. Because my parents were active in the church and the ministry, I came to cherish the opportunity to interact and worship with people like myself, youth who were Filipino Caucasian and Filipino Mexican. Of course, there were other ethnicities that would desire to worship in that faith and with the Filipino culture. I felt that this spiritual raising was very significant and would richly enhance, and did, my leadership style and wisdom, affecting many in my 33-year career with the California Department of Corrections running prisons. Remnants of the original ancestral heritage congregation of the church that I attended still exist, now located at the Christian Center on 3rd Street in Stockton. The environment has evolved to a warm and richly multicultural one. I still attend this church whenever possible. The reason I appreciated this youthful church experience and the environment that was offered by that church was because, per personal observation and experience, Filipinos and other ethnic minorities were not truly welcome in Caucasian-operated churches here at that time. Filipino attendance or membership in the congregation was passively and overtly discouraged. To this day, I remember the negative atmosphere, the snubs, the snide remarks that were directed to me when I would attend Sunday school classes at Caucasian churches. Though these experiences made me inwardly angry, I learned to tolerate these behaviors and psychologically suppress and process them. Sometimes I just rationalized that the perpetrators of them were simply simpletons, as one of my grammar school teachers aptly suggested. These racist experiences, however, had a lifelong impact on forging a foundation in my psyche as to where I belonged, where I did not belong, and where I should only tread at my own psychological peril. In 1945, my parents decided to culminate their courtship by getting married. However, their wish was thwarted by the existence of the anti-miscegenation law, which strictly forbade Filipinos to marry women of the Caucasian race, and in reality, Mexican women as well. This law had its roots dated back to Maryland law in 1664, which was then known as the Anti-Amalgamation Act. But consequently, my father and my mother traveled to Lordsburg, New Mexico to obtain a marriage license. Whenever I think of this event in their life, I still hurt for them. The anti-miscegenation law was set aside in California in 1946, but only by a slim margin vote. It was not until 1967, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, that the anti-miscegenation law was ruled unconstitutional in the United States Supreme Court, and then only by a very slim margin vote. I concluded that there was perhaps nothing more damaging to my American citizen psyche than to know that, in fact, being Filipino Caucasian or a mestizo of such forbidden ethnic compositions was, in essence, by interpretation of law, nationally, to construe illegitimacy, and that racism was in fact codified and sanctioned with legal standing in that time. Now, in retrospect, and obviously then as a youth, I concluded that racism was a way of life for most Americans during that era. In the American city I grew up in, Stockton, California, prejudice and racism was a matter of fact and rather unabashedly rampant. Growing up in Stockton, I experienced that it was not unusual to encounter blatant ethnic slurs on my Sunday drives with my parents north on Pacific Avenue and out toward Lincoln Center. Stockton schools were demographically segregated due to the logistics of where student mestizo youths and I could actually live, mainly south on Main Street. Real estate agents at the time were reluctant to show minority families property north of Harding Way. Consequently, schools north of Harding Way remained white in terms of student ethnic populations. Personally, the experiences of prejudice were so prevalent toward me as a Filipino Caucasian that the essence of it while growing up and throughout my life is indelibly ingrained in my mind. In my book, Life Experiences of a First Generation Caucasian American, I highlight a number of personal experiences of being the recipient of discriminatory behavior, including being demeaned in public by a patron in Woolworth dime store on our Main Street in Stockton about 1952, when, while in line at a pastry counter, I was referred to as a little brown, expletive because of being served ahead of he, a white patron, although I had been next in line. There are those of the Filipino as well as Caucasian descent who are uncomfortable when I speak of such blatant racism. I can tell as they lower their voice and they look around for who might be listening that they would prefer that I share this information quietly, as though they are ashamed that someone might hear it being said. I have to share, however, that such timidness makes me uncomfortable as I saw it happen. I was directly impacted by it. And that ugly or not, we and the Filipino immigrants, we were not the perpetrators of the anti-miscegenation laws or prejudicial practices which my parents and I subsequently were directly affected by. Most of us thought, and we hoped, that if we were quiet, if we were meek, and if we were peaceful, this would all go away. But given the recent reported rise in anti-Asian verbal insults, physical assaults across America, I feel compelled to advocate that those of means and or not should unify and legally confront transgressors to protect ourselves and our rights as Filipino Americans. My service in the military and as a Vietnam veteran did a lot to allow me to observe and respect the idiosyncrasies of others and to interact with Caucasians and other ethnicities from throughout the United States and the world as a good ambassador. I have come, however, to realize that we are entitled to our personal opinions, but that our judgments and our actions should be based on fact and tangible evidence, not subjective prejudices. Finally, I've learned to greet all others with a friendly smile, an appropriate warm greeting, regardless of their seeming attitude, positive or negative, toward me or others. I've concluded that their warm response or lack thereof says more about their deficiencies and hypocrisies as a person than it does my own. I am blessed to return to my hometown in Stockton, and I do love this hometown. And I thank all of you today for listening in and your interest in this presentation. Again, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Al. And now we'll have Lois Sahyoun and do hers. And all she has to do is unmute. And there she goes.
Good afternoon. My name is Lois Sahyoun. First of all, I'd like to thank the Stockton chapter of the FANHS for this opportunity to tell my personal story as a mestiza that was born and raised in Ketchikan, Alaska. I was, first part of my life, I attended schools, elementary school and high school up to my sophomore year in Ketchikan, Alaska. And then I came to California in 1962 and finished my education at Edison High School and continued taking classes at UOP and at Humphreys College. And I ended up working for San Joaquin County. I retired recently, 7 years ago, from San Joaquin County. I had 44 years of government service. 33 years of those was with San Joaquin County, and 10 years I worked for a United States congressman who represented the 14th Congressional District. Community service, I continue to be involved in the community. I currently am a member of the San Joaquin County Planning Commission, and I'm probably the longest serving planning commissioner. I'm going on my 24th year with them. I have previously served on the Stockton City Planning Commission, and I currently am a member of the Filipino associated organization with the Filipino Center. I'm on the board of directors of the Central Valley Chamber of Commerce, and also I'm on the San Joaquin County Historic Records Commission. My family background, I am a mestiza, half Filipino, Norwegian. My mother was a blonde, green-eyed woman. And then I'm also 1/8 Tlingit Indian, which is a tribe that is federally recognized by the federal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I even have an official card that says that. So Alaska, many of you have traveled to Alaska, and I used to have many former county employees ask me what Alaska was like. And I would tell them, I wouldn't tell them anything. I would tell them, you come back and tell me. And the one word that was always a descriptive word was the word majestic. And it is. And just to give you a little idea of Alaska, it's the largest state in the Union, 1/5 of the entire United States, and twice the size of Texas. You can only reach that part of Alaska that I was born and raised by boat or by plane. You cannot drive a car there. Alaska has more coastline than the rest of the United States combined, roughly 34,000 miles. It has 20 of the highest mountain peaks in the United States. 17 of them are in Alaska. And then Alaska has more than 3,000 rivers plus 3 million lakes. And the largest lake is 1,000 square miles. Now, Ketchikan, my hometown, Alaska is also known as the land of the midnight sun and the last frontier. And many of it even say it's God's last country, once you see the beautiful scenery that it has. So Ketchikan, it's the first city as you go into Alaska and leave Canadian waters. The last city you stop at in British Columbia is Prince Rupert. So many of the cruise lines, they go through Prince Rupert, and the first city into Alaska is Ketchikan. And it's located on Revilla Island, which is the 12th largest island in the United States. It was named after a Tlingit word, which is the Indian tribe I just told you about. And it is surrounded by 17 million acre, the National Tongass Forest. It's the largest in the United States. And it also is a city where we have the largest collection of totem poles by the Tlingit and Haida tribes. The cultural environment I grew up in was mainly Caucasian. The percentage probably was 74%, and the other remaining population were Tlingit or Haida members, and also there was a small Asian, maybe 5 families of Japanese, no Chinese, no Hispanic, no African Americans. So I grew up mainly with Caucasians that were of Scandinavian descent, Norwegians, Swedes, Danish, many Germans, and then the native Alaskans, those 2 tribes. But the economic environment there was primarily the fishing industry, the timber industry. We had a large pulp mill, and then the mining industry. And my Norwegian family, they were mainly fishermen. My grandfather was a fisherman. He had a trawler, and that's a boat that goes out with the lines, and they have the individual hooks. And I would work with my grandfather in the summers on those trolling boats. My brother worked on the larger fishing boats called seiners, where they gill netted with these huge nets, or they had mechanical hauling in systems where they would haul in the salmon. My hometown is also known as the salmon capital of the world. But my uncles on my mother's side, my Norwegian side, were all fishermen. In fact, 2 of my family members were lost at sea. One of my uncles, my oldest uncle, Samuel Svenning, he was on a ship with a good friend of his and 2 sons. They were in a storm. The ship started to go overtaken by waters. He and his son were able to get survival suits on the sons, and they survived. By my uncle and his friend did not survive. And the other one was my cousin, my first cousin. He was on a crabbing ship, and they were in the Gulf of Alaska, which is known to be very stormy, very rough waters, and they were caught in a storm. He was able to contact my uncle by a shortwave radio to let him know that they were in this horrendous storm. And then while he was talking to my uncle, all communication shut down. The whole ship was lost. The United States Coast Guard searched for that ship and did not even find one piece of anything from that ship. So my uncle and my first cousin, their names appear on a fisherman's memorial at Fisherman's Wharf in Seattle. And if you ever visit there, it's a beautiful memorial, and it has all the lists of Alaskan fishermen that were lost at sea. And many of them were Norwegians, like my family members. My introduction to California, I came here with my brother, my first visit to California, landed in San Francisco Airport, and the first African American I ever saw in person was a porter. And they greeted you as you came off the airport and carried your luggage. And while we were growing up, we always read about many of the racial tensions in the lower 48. And we called the other states the lower 48. That's what we referred to. He was very nice, took our luggage, had good conversation with us. He was able to get us a taxi cab. And I'll never forget, my brother and I, we looked at each other and we said, now, why is there all this trouble down there? We thought he was very nice and accommodating to us, and we just couldn't see why someone would not like this person because of his color. When we came to Stockton, actually it was French camp. That's where I mainly learned and Lathrop of my father's roots. He was from Baccara, Ilocos Norte, and he and my uncle, they came 1921 to America. They first worked in the Hawaiian plantations. I still have a payroll stub of my uncle's hours that he worked on those pineapple plantations. And I have some other papers of his that I've saved in our family's historical records. But I met many of his townmates that were from Baccara. They were very welcoming to us. We had, they had a huge party for us, and that was the first time I actually tasted all the Filipino food. I have to admit, I did not like the bagoong or the chocolate meat, but the rest was wonderful. And I learned how to cook all those dishes too. So, and then also it was interesting learning about the Filipino community in Stockton. So the first time we drove into Stockton, it was down Center Street, but that was, the name given to us was, this is Skid Row. So that was the first time for me even to hear of that word, Skid Row. And it was explained to us what Skid Row was. But then we also went to Onlock Sam's. Really, that was my first introduction to Chinese food. We took this little elevator up in the restaurant. It was very nice, the environment and everything, and we enjoyed it. So from that time on, I was very hungry to learn more about the Filipino community, which I did. And I participated in many of the activities of the youth organizations. And I remember attending the Dagohoy Lodge dances and parties. So I fit in well, but I didn't, it was a learning process for me too, because other Filipino kids didn't know my history either. So, and I know Anthony and Cabo, you're watching, and you met my brother. So, and he talks fondly of you as being one of his first Filipino friends. And I always appreciated knowing and learning from my first Filipino friends. And I'm still learning a lot of the history. Doris Unsad is one that I've learned a lot about. So now when I look back, my observations of Ketchikan versus Stockton, the only difference was the racial makeup, and the landscape differences, because in Alaska, which I described, a lot of nature surrounds you. Our home was on the water. You'd probably pay $5 million for a home on the water now. And here it was really different to see flat land. I had never seen houses with flat roofs, and what people described to me here as mountains, when let's go to big trees looked like my backyard at home. So that was differences. And I had never seen a drive-in theater before. When we drove past one, I didn't see the screen, but the little post sticking up. I thought it was some new kind of cemetery. And my brother and I, we continued to laugh about that, because we thought, gee, maybe everybody thinks that we're some, ignorant people, but we weren't. We were just in a different landscape. And so there was that cultural diversity difference, but and the economic difference too. Where I came from, it was a different industry. Like I said, fishing, timber, mining. Here was agriculture, and the port is a major part of Stockton's economic, and levels of government were different. There, and in Alaska, instead of counties, we were boroughs, which many states are. But so local politics was quite different than here, because you knew each other. The population was smaller. Where I came from, the population when I was born was probably 4,100. Now it's probably 82, so it's doubled. But you can compare how most people knew everyone. So you worked together closer. You were more of a knit community. Everybody knew each other's families. And here you did too, but I saw that division. I think someone said in their presentation, maybe it was Alfonso, a division of the housing where, you know, there was a definite line here in Stockton where Filipinos mainly lived in an area. The Okies from Oklahoma lived in a certain area, the Hispanics. Well, I didn't see that back in where I came from. Yes, there was an area that had the Tlingit tribe, but it was also an area where, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest totem pole collection in the world. So those cultural differences I saw. And then personally, any prejudice, I remember I was with my uncle, my brother, my father's brother. I used to take care of him, and I took care of him for 20 years. He was a farm laborer, worked out in the islands. He first worked in the San Mateo area, then the French Camp Lathrop, and out in the Delta. But one day I took him to an eye appointment, and the receptionist took him into the office, and I sat in a chair outside. His accent was still very pronounced, wasn't clear, and she had asked him a question, and he responded to her, but she could not understand him. And she used no diplomacy whatsoever in trying to understand him. So that upset me. So I got up and went in there and told him to get up from the chair, and we were leaving that place, and I never took him back there again. And I also indicated to her how rude she was, et cetera, et cetera. So that was really the only time I faced that kind of thing. I heard many stories from my uncle and other Filipinos, particularly during World War II. They indicated that when they had to come into town to buy supplies or new clothing, that especially during the war with Japan, that they had to wear signs that they were Filipino, not Japanese, so they wouldn't be attacked or ridiculed by the Caucasians here. My observations of Filipino versus Norwegian, personally, there's so many similarities. Family is important to both cultures, and both cultures are very close. If you came to my hometown, we would go to the Sons of Norway on Saturday night and have a huge smorgasbord, lots of food. Well, the same thing, you go to a Filipino gathering, lots of people and lots of food and music and dance. And Filipinos are musical, so are Norwegians. Filipinos are good dancers, so are Norwegians. My parents, I just had a question given to me, how my parents met, and I was going to get to that. My dad, he joined the military, and he was in the United States Coast Guard. Because I always get this question, how did a Filipino meet a Norwegian? So when he enlisted, his training was in Louisiana, and then he was stationed in Ketchikan, Alaska. And in my hometown of Ketchikan, Alaska is the largest Coast Guard base in southeastern Alaska. So that's how he met my mother. My mother's family was, they welcomed him into the family. He never felt any kind of being uncomfortable, or he was always welcomed in that family. So that's how a Norwegian met a Filipino, and a Filipino met a Norwegian. I think that I've had the best of two worlds. Growing up first in my Norwegian culture, and then later in my Filipino culture. And I think it's made me who I am, and I've passed that on to my children and grandchildren. And when I thought about what would I say to my dad now, and my Uncle Fernando, and my mom and Norwegian grandparents. And last night I did this really quickly, and I said I'd write them this letter. And it's an open letter to my Filipino and my Norwegian families. Dear Dad, Uncle Fernando, Mom, Grandmother Lillian, and Grandfathers Samuel and Harry, thank you for your courage and vision to immigrate to America. Since your arrival to the United States, 4 generations have been born. You made so many sacrifices in order that the future generations of our family would have a better life. The challenges you faced were many. However, you met them with your faith, personal strength, and determination. You taught us the importance of family and supporting each other. You promoted education. You encouraged hard work, and you gave us the foundation of values to succeed in life. You also taught and demonstrated that being a responsible person is one that engages in your community to help others. Your legacy will never be forgotten, but rather handed down to future family generations and carried on. Your mission indeed was accomplished. With all my love, your firstborn daughter and your firstborn granddaughter. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Lois. And thank you very much. That's a good idea, to write a letter, thanking. Hope everybody, does that for their family too. I thank you, all 3 of you, for speaking. And a lot of your story is kind of reminiscent of my grandfather's same story, but he didn't have any problems getting married to my grandmother, who was from Spain. And so I like to hear how they got married in 1924 here in Stockton. And I like to hear how others, the mestizos, how they all got together and what kind of things they went through, because I would have liked to been a fly on the registrar's office when they went in to get a marriage license. Why didn't anybody tell them, no, you can't marry a white woman? It was fine. They got married in the church, St. Mary's Church. So I'd like to know what was the thinking going on back then, because I hear all the stories about how everybody had problems. So anyway, if anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask any of the 3 speakers, I know that the one question was from someone was for Lois, wondering about how her parents met, because she hadn't gotten to that part yet. And Lois, do you speak Norwegian? Did your parents speak it? And did you, and then the other question was, what was her relationship with her classmates, her playmates? Because there was such because of your background, did you have any problems?
Actually, a couple days ago, I spoke to about 5 of the kids that I grew up with back home and my classmates. And I still go back home for my class reunions there. But no, we never, even the 4 Japanese families there, they never experienced any kind of prejudice either, or, you know, being called out for being a different race. And the one question I asked each of them, why do you think that was? And I think it was a consensus of all of us that one reason, we were geographically further away from the actions of the lower 48, that we weren't affected by that much. We read about things that happened in the lower 48, but none of it was applicable to us. We just, that wasn't ever an issue. So none of us ever had that.
Okay.
What was the second question now?
Well, did you speak Norwegian? Did they speak
Oh,
Norwegian?
you know, when I was younger, I could, but now I'd have to go and brush off. Now there's some words I can still remember and everything.
Okay.
But maybe one day, if you have a future event at the museum, I can make some lefse for everybody.
Oh,
And
that'd be
that's a
great.
Norwegian bread that you all would like.
And that's what we're hoping one day, that we can get everybody back into the museum. Today, I mean, normally when we have our presentations, we might have a dozen people because of the location. They have to be in the area. But, you know, we had over 25 people at least listening today from different places around the country. So that's good. So I do like the way the Zoom presentations offer several other people to come in from around the country. So what we're going to have to do is figure out how to do our presentations live in person, plus on using Zoom, so that we can get a bigger audience in here, because our main focus is to get this history, this information out to educate, you know, who can't come here and who want to learn about Filipino American history. So does anybody else have any other questions for either of the speakers? I don't see anything in the chat. I don't see people waving hands.
It looks like Mel.
I have a question.
Okay, Mel.
I want to thank each one of you, the guest speakers, because it's geographically, you covered quite a bit of terrain, you know, all the way from Alaska to through California. And I had in my background, it was Black and Irish mother who married a Ilocano Filipino father. But food was a common denominator in all 3 of your discussions. And I'm wondering how the Caucasian or the European part of the family accepted the Filipino food. And each one of you can make a comment one way or another. I know my dad was always in the kitchen cooking, and it was a cultural shock to my mother's side of the family, because they never really ate rice or a chop suey or vegetables, and adobo was brand new to them. So all that food was brand new. And I'm wondering how the European part of your heritage accepted food.
Okay, I'll be the first to answer that. Mel, my grandmother was a great cook and she was an avid reader. So she used to improvise because we didn't have all of the available products to cook a variety of different cultural dishes. So she would make a chop suey. But she would make it out of venison. And we have a vegetable, I'm not sure if you'd even categorize it a vegetable, but it grows on the beach, the shorelines. And we called it a goose tongue because it was shaped like a goose's tongue, but very firm vegetable. So she would get that and chop it up with onions and some other wild mushrooms and call that a chop suey. But when my grandmother first came to California, I would send for my grandparents to come here. I think one of the first things they tasted was adobo, and that was a big hit. So adobo, everyone liked.
Thank you, Lois.
Yeah, Mel, I'll answer very briefly here. I was married into a Caucasian family, and my mother and my father, being from different ethnic backgrounds, my mother wanted her mashed potatoes, my father wanted his steamed rice every day. And so consequently, when I became a part of another family, we were having Thanksgiving dinner, and my mother-in-law said, well, what would you like to have with this? And I included in that steamed rice. And I felt comfortable with that. And she said, well, we're already having a starch. We're having mashed potatoes. So that was an interesting situation. But that worked out well. We got both. But in my situation at home, my mother always respected that my father's diet was different in some ways, and there were some items that she did not particularly feel that great about. It was different to her palate. And my father wasn't all that happy about actually eating corn or mashed potatoes. So my mother and father both respected each other. And so normally we would have both at the dinner table. And that's kind of how that worked out. And thank you, Mel.
Thank you, Al.
Yeah, in my case, my mother actually learned how to cook Filipino food, but not all the fancy stuff. I didn't know about all the things you can find in Filipino restaurants now, but it's what the Filipinos living on farms back then were eating. And of course, rice every day, 100-pound sack of rice always around. And I guess she set limits on, she didn't like to eat snails, because we could collect snails from the coast or here in the rivers here too, or Deniguan, she didn't care for. But she adapted pretty well to Filipino food. She and my father divorced, but her second husband also was Filipino, and she kept cooking Filipino to cook, I think, and so they could teach their wife.
You keep your Richard, you keep going in and out.
Oh, I do.
But we got the gist of it, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank
Okay,
you. Food's a common denominator in life in general, but I know that on my mom's side, after probably 4 or 5 months after my parents were married, we would get phone calls from different relatives on my mom's side, and they would say, "Hey, Marge, when you going to make some more of that adobe?" And they couldn't pronounce it right, but they knew what they wanted. And food was was pretty much accepted on my mom's side. But it was a cultural shock to them because they just never had rice every day or all the vegetables that went along with the rice.
Okay.
Meat dishes. Thank you.
Someone is asking that, about whether the three speakers have been to the Philippines and how were you received as mestizos? Lois, have you been to the Philippines?
No, I have not been to the Philippines.
Okay. How about Al? You're muted, Al. Unmute yourself. And then we know Richard's been there, so he can talk about his experiences. But
Tell me when. Is Al still trying to get talk?
yeah, he's muted. Oh, okay, now he's
Am
off.
I open? Okay. And the question was what, Terry?
If you'd been to have you gone to the Philippines?
Yes.
And how were you received as a mestizo? Did it matter?
Oh, it did matter. And quite frankly, I was not received very well at all, particularly in the town of Olongapo and the area of Manila. And that's a topic for another book or another presentation.
Okay. And Richard?
I've been to the Philippines a number of times, and I have no trouble at all. I feel at home. I've got lots of friends there. I'm still in touch with people on a regular basis in the Philippines. They're not my relatives. And actually, I'm a dual citizen too. I have a Philippine passport. Several years ago, when I found out I was eligible, because when I was born, my father could not become a Philippine citizen. I mean, American citizen at that time. So he's still a Philippine citizen. And by Philippine law, if the father, now it's either parent, but when I applied, if the father was a Filipino citizen when you were a Philippine citizen when you were born, then you're a Filipino by birth. So I went down and applied for my passport and citizenship and got it within 6 weeks. But yeah, I like the Philippines, and I've been, all the way from Ilocos to Sulu and Tawi-Tawi, and enjoy it. I spent a lot of time in other parts of Southeast Asia too.
Okay. Well, if does anybody else have anything they want to say? Anybody? Nothing else to chat. Otherwise, we'd like to thank everybody for coming and for joining us today. And we have someone who's raising their hand. Victoria, was there something you wanted to say?
No, I was just clapping, but
Okay.
I will say that my family really appreciates everyone's stories and experiences, and we love to continue learning. So we're excited for the museum to open back up.
Yes, so are we. And we've been training some of our new board members, and we're getting personnel together, and we are training people under COVID guidelines, but then we don't know what's going to happen June 15th. And so as long as our county says that we can reopen, whether under now guidelines or new guidelines, we are going to start scheduling right now appointments for visitors to come in. And then when we can be open like normal, then we'll just be open like normal. So we are shooting now for the weekend after Father's Day. So as soon as we figure out what happens on June 15th, we're going to put out a big notice for everybody to start signing up to come in, or maybe we can just be open like normal. So we thank everybody for being here today. We thank all of you for showing your support. And there's a lot of repeat customers that I like seeing everybody showing up again, and people used to come in person to our presentations. Hopefully we can continue to do that, return doing that. So thank you, all of you. And this will be on our YouTube channel, however long it takes to render and then upload. So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again, and we'll try and plan a presentation for June. And anybody who has ideas of or wishes to talk about their history, wishes just to do a book reading about their new books coming out, or anything like that, we welcome you to contact us, and we will figure something out. We have an Alascaro exhibit that we're working on, thanks to the Pallar family. And we just received a box of information about Pablo Manlapit and the Hawaiian plantation strikes. And so we're going to try and do something with that. So, thank you everybody for being here, and we will see you when we see you. Okay.
And thank all of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.